A karate champion punched a royal guard's horse, thinking his martial arts mastery made him untouchable. But 3 quiet words from the guard made the magnificent beast rise up on its hind legs, and suddenly the champion was flat on his back, staring up at the true meaning of discipline. Here's what happened. The morning sun cast long shadows across Horse Guard's parade as tourists gathered in anticipation of the daily ceremony. Among the sea of excited faces and clicking cameras stood Kai Ryu, his athletic frame radiating impatience as he checked the time on his luxury watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The historic grounds bustled with activity as tour guides explained the centuries-old traditions to attentive groups. Children pointed excitedly at the imposing architecture, and photographers jockeyed for prime positions to capture the pageantry about to unfold. "This is what people wake up early to see?" Kai muttered, adjusting the collar of his designer tracksuit, emblazoned with the logos of his numerous sponsors. Men and horses standing still? At 32, Kai Ryu had accumulated accolades most martial artists only dreamed of: 5 international championships, a signature fighting style that had revolutionized competitive karate, and a following of devoted students across 3 continents. His appearance in London for the Royal Albert Hall exhibition had sold out in minutes, with fans eager to witness the living legend demonstrate his lightning-fast techniques. Sports magazines had dubbed him the Dragon for his ability to strike with seemingly impossible speed and precision, leaving judges struggling to score points they could barely see happen. "Mr. Ryu, we should really head to the venue for sound check," his assistant, Thomas, suggested timidly, clutching a tablet containing Kai's meticulously planned schedule. "In a minute," Kai replied, his eyes narrowing as he watched tourists posing for photos with the stoic guards. "Tell me something, Thomas. What's more impressive, a man who can break concrete blocks with his bare hands, or a man who can stand still wearing a funny hat?" Before Thomas could answer, Kai was already cutting through the crowd, his purposeful stride carrying him toward the ceremonial guards. His presence turned heads, a few martial arts enthusiasts recognizing the champion, whispering excitedly to their companions. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing toward Kai with wide-eyed recognition, perhaps having seen one of his viral tournament videos that had garnered millions of views online. There, positioned with perfect military bearing, sat Guard Crispin Halley atop Sovereign, a magnificent black stallion whose coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the morning light. Both horse and rider embodied the pinnacle of ceremonial perfection. Halley's scarlet tunic immaculate, his posture unwavering, while Sovereign stood with the disciplined stillness that came from years of rigorous training. The morning breeze occasionally ruffled the horse's mane, but neither this nor the buzzing tourist seemed to register in the guard's focused gaze, which remained fixed on a distant point as tradition demanded. Kai positioned himself where he could study the mounted guard, his expert eye analyzing every detail with the same intensity he applied to sizing up opponents in the ring. He noticed the subtle signs of combat readiness that most tourists missed. The perfectly balanced stance that would allow for immediate movement, the controlled breathing pattern, the alert awareness beneath the ceremonial stillness. Yet, in his arrogance, he dismissed these as irrelevant to what he considered real combat skill. "Look at this, Thomas," Kai said, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "They call this discipline. Standing still for hours isn't discipline. It's glorified statue impersonation." A small circle of space formed around Kai as tourists sensed the disrespect in his tone, parents guiding their children away from the brewing confrontation. But Kai seemed to feed off the attention, his voice growing louder. Several onlookers exchanged uncomfortable glances, the British among them particularly affronted by the disrespect being shown to one of their treasured institutions. In real combat, stillness gets you killed. These traditions might look pretty, but they're relics of a time when warfare was about parades and formations. He gestured dismissively towards Sovereign. And using horses in the age of drones and tanks? Pure theatrical nostalgia. Sir, a quiet but firm voice came from behind him. An elderly man with military bearing and a veteran's pin on his lapel had approached. The pin bore the insignia of the Royal Anglian Regiment, and the man's posture, despite his age, spoke of decades of military discipline that had become second nature. I couldn't help overhearing. Perhaps I could explain the significance of the Horse Guards. Kai gave the man a dismissive once-over. Let me guess. You're going to tell me about tradition and heritage and all that. Actually, the man replied, unfazed by Kai's tone, I was going to tell you about Afghanistan, where I served alongside the very regiment these guards represent. About how household cavalry horses and their riders undergo some of the most rigorous training in the military world. For a moment, something flickered in Kai's eyes, perhaps genuine curiosity, but it was quickly replaced by the practiced arrogance that had become his public persona. Training to stand still isn't training for combat, Kai replied dismissively. I've studied martial disciplines from 7 countries. Real fighting is about movement, adaptation, speed. The veteran's expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened slightly. You might be surprised, Mr. Ryu. These aren't just ceremonial units. Many of these guards and horses have seen active combat. Their discipline isn't performative, it's practical. Kai gave a short, incredulous laugh. Are you suggesting these tourist attractions could hold their own in a real fight against someone like me? Thomas fidgeted anxiously beside him. Mr. Ryu, the schedule. In a minute, Kai snapped, his attention locked on Guard Halley and Sovereign, their perfect stillness now seeming like a personal challenge to everything he represented. A vein pulsed at Kai's temple, betraying the competitive fire that had driven him to championship status, but also fueled his worst impulses. To him, any form of martial discipline other than his own was inherently inferior until proven otherwise, and he was increasingly determined to prove his point here and now. Look at them all, Kai said, irritation creeping into his voice as he watched tourists snapping photos of the mounted guard. These people have no idea what real skill looks like. They'd rather worship statues than appreciate actual combat mastery. Thomas checked his tablet nervously. Several reporters are waiting at Royal Albert Hall for your pre-exhibition interview, Mr. Ryu. Your sponsors would, My sponsors want publicity, Kai cut him off, a calculating look crossing his face. And what better publicity than showing the difference between ceremonial pageantry and actual martial skill? The morning crowd had grown thicker, with tour groups clustering around the mounted guards. Despite Kai's international fame, not a single tourist had approached him for an autograph or photo. All eyes were on the timeless spectacle of the Royal Guards. This subtle slight to his ego only fueled Kai's determination to demonstrate his superiority, to force these tourists to recognize what he considered real skill over empty tradition. This is absurd, Kai announced, his voice rising deliberately. These horses are practically obsolete in modern warfare. What's the point of maintaining this expensive spectacle? Nostalgia. A mother pulled her young son away, throwing a disapproving glance in Kai's direction. This only seemed to fuel his determination. The boy, perhaps 7 or 8, looked back at Kai with confused disappointment, clearly a fan who had recognized his idol but couldn't reconcile the champion's behavior with his admiration. You know what the problem with British military tradition is? Kai continued, walking a slow circle around where he could be seen by both tourists and the mounted guard. It's all about appearance over function, form over effectiveness. It's why martial arts evolved beyond ceremonial forms into practical combat techniques. The veteran who had spoken earlier moved closer again. Young man, there's more to military horsemanship than you understand. The household cavalry, Kai interrupted, is the perfect example of clinging to outdated traditions while the rest of the world moves forward. In an age of modern warfare, they're maintaining cavalry units like it's still the 1800s. The veteran's expression tightened. These men and horses maintain centuries of tradition, yes, but they're also operational soldiers. Many have served in Afghanistan, Iraq. Serving tea to diplomats isn't the same as combat, Kai scoffed. I've trained fighters who could run circles around these parade ground performers. More tourists were turning now, the rising tension drawing their attention away from photos and toward the confrontation brewing near Sovereign and Guard Halley. The crowd had grown into a loose semicircle, with some onlookers filming the interaction on their phones, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding in front of the usually unchanging ceremonial guards. A real warrior, Kai announced to the growing audience, adapts to changing conditions, evolves with technology and tactics, doesn't waste time standing motionless for tourist photos. He gestured dramatically towards Sovereign, whose ears had shifted slightly at the commotion, but who otherwise maintained perfect discipline. The subtle ear movement wasn't lost on experienced observers. It was the only outward sign that the highly trained military horse was tracking every sound and movement while maintaining his perfect ceremonial bearing. The veteran stepped directly into Kai's path now, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority of command experience. Sir, that horse has seen more combat than most soldiers. The bond between cavalry troopers and their mounts is built on absolute trust in life-or-death situations, not pageantry. Kai sized up the older man, noting the military bearing that age hadn't diminished. If you really believe a ceremonial horse and its rider represent actual combat effectiveness, you're living in the past. And you, the veteran replied evenly, are confusing showmanship with warfare. Perhaps that works in tournaments with referees and rules, but... Rules? Kai laughed sharply. You think my techniques only work in tournaments? The disciplines I've mastered have been battlefield tested for centuries. A small crowd had formed a loose circle around them now, tourists sensing the brewing confrontation. Thomas was practically vibrating with anxiety, his attempts to remind Kai of his schedule now falling on deaf ears. Several household cavalry members off duty had noticed the commotion and were watching from a distance, their expressions unreadable, but their posture alert to the potential disruption of ceremonial protocol. I'll tell you what, Kai said, his voice carrying across the parade ground. I'll demonstrate what real combat discipline looks like. Then we can all judge whether standing still in pretty uniforms is worthy of such fascination. The veteran's expression darkened. Young man, interfering with the Queen's guard is... But Kai had already turned away, moving toward an open space where he'd be visible to both the crowd and the mounted guard. With the practiced showmanship of a tournament champion, Kai moved to a clear space within view of Guard Halley and Sovereign. He shrugged off his designer jacket, revealing a compression shirt emblazoned with his personal logo and sponsor branding. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice projecting with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Today, you'll see the difference between ceremony and combat readiness. Thomas stood frozen at the edge of the gathering crowd, his tablet clutched to his chest like a shield. The veteran took a step forward, then stopped, recognizing the determined look of someone who wouldn't be easily dissuaded. Kai began with basic stances, his movements crisp and precise. His body flowed through forms with the fluid grace that had made him famous, each position executed with textbook perfection. Despite themselves, several tourists lowered their cameras from the mounted guard to capture Kai's impromptu demonstration. This is Shotokan Karate, Kai explained between movements, his breathing perfectly controlled. A discipline focused on practical effectiveness, not standing still for tourists. He transitioned smoothly into more complex kata, his speed increasing, each punch and kick slicing through the air with deadly precision. With each sequence, he edged closer to where Sovereign stood motionless, the horse's discipline unwavering, despite the unexpected activity nearby. True discipline, Kai called out between movements, isn't about suppressing reaction. It's about controlling it, channeling it. The veteran moved through the crowd, approaching a uniformed police officer who had noticed the gathering spectators. They conversed quietly, the officer's expression growing concerned as he observed Kai's increasingly elaborate demonstration. Combat readiness, Kai continued, executing a blindingly fast combination just feet from Sovereign's position, means responding to threats with precision and speed, not ignoring them. Each technique brought him closer to the mounted guard. Sovereign's ears flickered slightly, the only indication that the horse was aware of the unusual activity, but Guard Halley remained perfectly motionless, eyes forward, the embodiment of ceremonial discipline. "Sir," the veteran called out, his voice carrying the authority of former command, "you're interfering with official duties. I must ask you to step back." Kai paused mid-form, sweat now gleaming on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Interfering. I'm complementing their performance with one of my own, showing these people what active combat discipline looks like." He launched into his most impressive sequence yet, a combination of spinning kicks and precision strikes that had won him his last championship. The techniques brought him within arm's reach of Sovereign, his movements deliberately flashy, designed to provoke a reaction. "See how the horse ignores me," Kai called to the crowd. "That's not discipline, that's desensitization. In actual combat, awareness saves lives, not blind obedience." The police officer was now pushing through the crowd, speaking into his radio. More tourists had gathered, phones recording the unexpected confrontation between martial arts champion and royal tradition. "Last warning," the veteran said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "Step back." But Kai was fully committed now, his ego driving him forward into an elaborate jumping spin kick that brought him perilously close to Sovereign's head. The black stallion remained impressively still, though a subtle tensing of muscles betrayed his awareness of the human projectile that had just narrowly missed him. "In a real combat situation," Kai announced, landing with perfect balance just feet from the horse, "this level of non-responsiveness would get you killed. Real warriors must be ready to react, to adapt." He moved into his final demonstration, a complex sequence of strikes that pushed the boundaries of human speed and control. The crowd watched in a mixture of appreciation for his skill and discomfort at his deliberate provocation. The morning air seemed to crackle with tension as Kai launched into his signature technique, a lightning-fast spinning combination that had become his trademark in international competitions. His body twisted with the precision of a gymnast and the power of a heavyweight boxer, each movement calculated for maximum visual impact. "This," he announced to the now substantial crowd, "is the Thunder Dragon technique, banned in most tournaments because judges can't track its speed." His body became a blur of controlled violence, fists and feet cutting through the air with surgical precision. Tourists who had come for the traditional changing of the guard now found themselves witnesses to an unauthorized duel between ancient ceremony and modern combat sport, tradition versus spectacle. Guard Halley maintained his ceremonial position, eyes forward, bearing unchanged, despite the human tornado spinning just feet away. Sovereign stood equally motionless, though the subtle flick of his ears betrayed his awareness of the unusual activity. The veteran had positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, his face grim as he watched Kai's increasingly provocative display. The police officer was speaking urgently into his radio, requesting backup for what was quickly evolving into a potential security incident. "Perfect control," Kai called out, his voice not even slightly strained despite the complex maneuvers. "This is what real discipline looks like, not just standing still, but mastering movement itself." He pivoted into the final sequence of his demonstration, a series of spinning strikes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The crowd gasped appreciatively, phones raised to capture the champion's extraordinary skill. As Kai executed the final spin, his right fist extended in what should have been a perfectly controlled strike designed to stop inches from its target. Instead, his knuckles connected solidly with Sovereign's flank. The impact wasn't particularly hard, nowhere near the force Kai could generate when breaking boards or concrete blocks, but the intent was unmistakable. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a deathly silence that seemed to swallow all of London's usual noise. For one frozen moment, nothing moved. Not the crowd, not the guard, not even Sovereign, whose discipline held despite the clear provocation. The only motion was a slight smile spreading across Kai's face, the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd proven his point. "As I was saying," he declared into the stunned silence, "real combat requires—" His words died as he registered the change in Guard Halley's demeanour. Though the guard's posture remained ceremonial, his eyes had shifted, fixing Kai with a gaze that carried centuries of military authority. It wasn't anger in those eyes, but something far more unsettling. The calm, measured assessment of a genuine soldier evaluating a threat. For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across Kai's confident expression. He had expected the guard to remain frozen in ceremonial stillness, proving his point about outdated traditions. What he saw instead was the controlled vigilance of someone who had mastered discipline not as an end unto itself, but as a foundation for decisive action. The veteran stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "You've just assaulted a serving member of Her Majesty's Household Cavalry." Each word fell like a judge's gavel. "That's not just disrespectful, it's a criminal offence." Kai maintained his fighting stance, but something had changed in his bearing. A barely perceptible uncertainty, like a chess player who suddenly realizes they've walked into a prepared trap. "I barely touched the horse," he replied, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "Besides, if these are such highly trained combat animals, shouldn't they be able to handle a little contact?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, the crowd holding its collective breath as they waited to see how tradition would respond to this deliberate challenge. Sovereign discipline. Guard Halley's voice cut through the silence with the clarity of a ceremonial trumpet, each syllable precisely enunciated. Though he spoke quietly, his words carried across the parade ground with unquestionable authority. It wasn't the volume that commanded attention, but the weight of genuine authority behind each word. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, Sovereign moved. The transformation was extraordinary. The seemingly statue-like horse exploded into controlled action, rising majestically onto his hind legs with the precision of a dancer. His forelegs pawed at the air, not in wild aggression, but with the controlled power of an animal that had mastered its own formidable strength. Sovereign's movement unfolded with a grace that belied his size and power. His head rose high, mane catching the morning sunlight like a warrior's banner. Guard Halley remained perfectly balanced in the saddle, his posture adapting seamlessly to the horse's new position, without the slightest hint of uncertainty or effort. Together, horse and rider presented a tableau of martial prowess that seemed to reach back through centuries of battlefield history, the living embodiment of disciplined strength that had once turned the tide of wars. Kai stumbled backward, unprepared for this sudden transformation from ceremonial statue to imposing warhorse. His foot caught on the uneven ground, and the five-time world champion found himself falling ungracefully onto his back, staring up at the magnificent creature now towering above him. The crowd's collective gasp turned to murmurs of awe. Parents lifted children to better see this unexpected display, while dozens of phones captured the moment that would soon spread across the internet, with titles like "Martial Arts Champion Humbled by Royal Horse." A group of school children on a field trip broke into spontaneous applause, their teacher unable to maintain order in the face of such an extraordinary display. Sovereign held the impressive pose for precisely 3 seconds before settling back to all fours with the same controlled grace with which he'd risen. The movement contained no wasted energy, no excessive flourish, just the perfect execution of centuries-old training designed for battlefield effectiveness. Guard Halley's face remained impassive, but something had changed in his bearing. The ceremonial stillness had given way to the alert readiness of an active duty soldier, a subtle but unmistakable shift from tradition to function. With fluid precision that matched any of Kai's martial demonstrations, Guard Halley dismounted. His movements were economy personified, no flourish, no wasted motion, just perfect efficiency, born of countless hours of training. He landed lightly beside Sovereign, one hand still on the reins, his posture transforming from ceremonial guard to combat veteran in the space of a heartbeat. The crowd had retreated slightly, forming a wider circle around this unexpected confrontation. The veteran stood at the edge of this impromptu arena, a knowing expression on his weathered face, the look of someone witnessing a lesson he'd seen delivered before. "Mr. Ryu," Guard Halley said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority as his command to Sovereign had. "I believe you've confused ceremony with capacity." Kai pushed himself up to a sitting position, his designer training clothes now smudged with dust from the parade ground. For once, the champion seemed at a loss for words. "What you're witnessing," Guard Halley continued, "isn't an outdated tradition maintained for tourists. It's the visible tip of a combat discipline that stretches back centuries and continues to serve on modern battlefields." He gestured to Sovereign, whose alert stance now conveyed unmistakable martial readiness despite his ceremonial trappings. Sovereign has served 2 tours in Afghanistan. His training allows him to remain calm under gunfire, navigate terrain impassable to vehicles, and carry wounded soldiers from active combat zones. Guard Halley's hand rested lightly on Sovereign's neck, the gesture conveying a partnership formed through shared danger and absolute trust. "The stillness you mocked isn't the absence of combat readiness, Mr. Ryu. It's its foundation. We don't move, not because we can't, but because centuries of battlefield experience have taught us when we should." Around them, the crowd had fallen completely silent, tourists and Londoners alike recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the ceremonial changing of the guard they'd come to see, but a genuine demonstration of the military excellence that underpinned it. "True discipline," Guard Halley said, his eyes locked on Kai's, "isn't about constant motion or flashy techniques. It's about perfect control, knowing precisely when to stand fast and when to act." Sovereign stood beside his rider, the two of them presenting a unified image of martial dignity that made Kai's earlier demonstration seem suddenly theatrical and hollow. Guard Halley stood with the straight-backed posture of a soldier who had earned his bearing through actual service rather than parade ground practice. The morning sun glinted off his brass buttons, and the medals that spoke of combat deployments far from the ceremonial splendour of Whitehall. "Before I wore this ceremonial uniform, Mr. Ryu," he began, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who knew precisely who he was, "I led mounted patrols through Helmand Province. Before Sovereign carried me on parade grounds, he carried medical supplies through terrain no vehicle could navigate under active enemy fire." Kai had risen to his feet now, brushing dust from his designer training clothes. The crowd had grown silent, tourists who had come for photos, now witnesses to an unexpected confrontation between different worlds. "This uniform," Guard Halley continued, gesturing to his immaculate scarlet tunic, "isn't a costume. It's a visible connection to a fighting tradition that has adapted and evolved through centuries of actual warfare. The discipline you see isn't for show, it's functional, tested in combat where lives depend on it. Kai's expression had shifted from his earlier arrogance to something more complex, not quite humility, but perhaps the first fissures in his certainty. In your martial arts demonstrations, Mr. Ryu, you have the luxury of showcasing speed and spectacle. In battle, we prioritize effectiveness and survival. Guard Halley's words carried no anger, just the steady confidence of hard-earned experience. The stillness you mocked has a purpose beyond ceremony. It builds the foundation of self-control that battlefield chaos demands. The veteran nodded, almost imperceptibly from his position at the edge of the crowd, recognition passing between soldiers who shared an understanding civilians rarely grasped. What you just witnessed from Sovereign wasn't a trick or a trained performance, Guard Halley explained, his hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. It was a battlefield maneuver designed to intimidate opposing cavalry and infantry, a technique perfected over centuries because it worked in actual combat. He turned slightly, including the gathered crowd in his explanation now. Every movement in our ceremonial routines evolved from battlefield functionality. The precision of our marching derives from the need to maintain formation under fire. The commands have been shortened and clarified through centuries of battlefield use. Guard Halley's gaze returned to Kai. Your martial arts speak of battlefield origins too, do they not? But somewhere along the way, many of those arts prioritized, spectacle over effectiveness, competition over combat utility. The observation landed with uncomfortable precision. Kai shifted his weight, the movement betraying his unease in a way no skilled martial artist would normally allow. The noisy brilliance of tournament fighting has its place, Guard Halley acknowledged, but silent effectiveness determines survival on the battlefield. Your technical mastery is impressive, Mr. Ryu, but it's calibrated for applause, not combat. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people recognized the truth in the guard's assessment. Even those with no military experience could sense the difference between Kai's flashy demonstrations and the calm, functional authority Guard Halley projected. Tradition without purpose is indeed mere ceremony, Guard Halley continued, but our traditions serve purposes refined through centuries of warfare. Every aspect of what you see here, from how we stand to how Sovereign responds to commands, has been tested and refined where failure meant death, not lost points in a competition. Sovereign remained perfectly positioned beside his rider, the two of them presenting a unified image of martial discipline that required no movement to convey its authority. You speak of adaptation as if it's the exclusive domain of modern martial arts, Guard Halley said, his voice taking on a subtle edge. Yet the household cavalry has adapted through centuries of changing warfare, from sabres against muskets to mounted reconnaissance in an age of drones. We preserve traditions that work while evolving those that don't. For the first time that morning, Kai looked truly unsettled, his worldview visibly shifting as he confronted a form of martial discipline that couldn't be categorized within his competitive framework. The next time you witness ceremonial stillness, Mr. Ryu, Guard Halley concluded, perhaps consider that you're not seeing the absence of combat readiness, but its distilled essence. Not meaningless tradition, but battlefield wisdom encoded in every precise movement and moment of controlled stillness. With perfect military precision, Guard Halley took a measured step back, his posture shifting subtly from confrontational to ceremonial once more. True masters in any discipline, he said, his final words carrying across the now silent parade ground, recognize and respect mastery in others, even when it takes forms they don't immediately understand. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the morning air as military police vehicles pulled up at the edge of the parade ground. Guard Halley, with perfect ceremonial precision, remounted Sovereign in one fluid motion. The transition from confrontation back to ceremonial duty was executed with the same disciplined excellence as everything else the guard had demonstrated. Kai stood motionless, his martial artist's bearing now uncertain. For perhaps the first time in his professional career, he had been rendered speechless not by defeat, but by a demonstration of discipline that existed entirely outside his framework of competition and spectacle. A senior officer approached, his uniform marking him as a guard captain. He assessed the situation with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to command decisions. "Mr. Ryu," the captain said, having evidently recognized the martial arts champion, "I understand there's been an incident involving one of our mounted guards." Kai straightened his posture, muscle memory from years of formal martial arts training asserting itself. "I was demonstrating combat techniques, and there was incidental contact with the horse." The veteran who had witnessed the entire confrontation stepped forward. "Incidental is not how I would describe it, Captain. Mr. Ryu here deliberately provoked your guard and struck Sovereign." The captain's expression hardened. "That's a serious offence, Mr. Ryu. Interfering with the Queen's Guard carries criminal penalties, but assaulting a serving military animal adds additional charges." Military police had formed a loose perimeter, maintaining order as the regular changing of the guard ceremony would need to proceed despite the disruption. Tourists who had witnessed the confrontation were already sharing videos and photos on social media, the incident spreading across the internet even as it was being resolved on the ground. "I think perhaps Mr. Ryu didn't fully understand the nature of our mounted guards," the captain said, his tone measured, but leaving no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "These aren't ceremonial animals. They're serving members of Her Majesty's armed forces, with actual combat deployments and specialised training." Thomas, Kai's assistant, pushed through the crowd, his tablet still clutched like a shield. "Mr. Ryu has a performance this evening. Surely we can resolve this without—" "What happens next isn't up to me," the captain interrupted crisply. "Interfering with guards on duty is a matter for the Metropolitan Police. They'll determine appropriate charges." Two police officers approached, their expressions suggesting they'd already reviewed witness statements and possibly footage of the incident. "Mr. Ryu," the lead officer said, "we need you to come with us to provide a statement regarding this incident." For a man accustomed to commanding attention on his own terms, the sudden shift to becoming the subject of official scrutiny was visibly jarring. Kai's posture, always perfect in the demonstration ring, now betrayed tension. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "I was simply demonstrating the difference between ceremonial discipline and actual combat readiness." "And I believe," the captain replied evenly, "that Guard Halley and Sovereign have provided quite a thorough education on that subject already." A ripple of appreciation moved through the witnesses who had seen the entire confrontation unfold. Several tourists nodded in agreement, phones still raised to capture this unexpected conclusion to what they'd thought would be a routine changing of the guard. As the police officers escorted Kai toward their waiting vehicle, the exhibition champion threw one last glance toward Guard Halley and Sovereign. They had resumed their ceremonial position, posture perfect, bearing unchanged, the living embodiment of a martial tradition that had weathered far greater challenges than one misguided martial artist. The morning sun now fully illuminated the parade ground as the regular changing of the guard ceremony began, precisely on schedule despite the disruption. Tourists turned their attention back to the time-honoured tradition, though conversations buzzed with excited recounting of the unexpected drama they'd witnessed. Guard Halley and Sovereign remained at their post, the perfect stillness that Kai had so dismissively mocked now carrying new meaning for all who had witnessed their brief but powerful demonstration of true martial discipline. In the quiet aftermath of confrontation, tradition had not merely endured. It had revealed its deeper purpose, reminding all who witnessed it that ceremonial precision was built upon the solid foundation of battlefield effectiveness. The lesson would be remembered long after the day's ceremony concluded. What we witnessed today was more than just a confrontation between a martial arts champion and a royal guard. It was a powerful reminder of the different forms discipline can take. While one sought to impress through movement and spectacle, the other demonstrated the quiet strength that comes from centuries of battlefield-tested tradition. The royal guards and their horses continue to stand watch, not just as living symbols of British heritage, but as active duty military personnel whose ceremonial precision reflects their operational excellence. Their discipline isn't theatrical. It's functional, forged through actual service, and refined by generations of soldiers who understood that true martial authority often speaks most powerfully through controlled stillness. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the Royal Guards. Don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now to discover more fascinating encounters that teach us about respect, tradition, and the unexpected lessons that come from understanding disciplines different from our own. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What impressed you most about Sovereign's response to the command? And have you ever witnessed a moment where someone mistook ceremonial discipline for weakness, only to learn a powerful lesson about true strength? Until next time, remember that sometimes the most impressive discipline isn't found in flashy movements, but in knowing exactly when to move and when to stand your ground.